Oh, that was a party. I didn't even go to the electronic dance. All right, here we go. Du Bois and the Myths of National History. So W.E.B. Du Bois, I think, was a Pan-African Marxist at the end of his days, but let's find out. William Edward Bogarted Du Bois. Oh, that's what it is. W.E.B. Du Bois. I always mess up that up. Was one of the finest historians ever developed in the United States. The writing of history, though, was but one of his achievements. Though extricatingly shy, he combined statesmanship and political activism with scholarship. In this way, he managed to influence the lives and thoughts of legions, and notwithstanding the rigors of research, he found the time to inaugurate the systematic development of Black studies. To found and edit for more than 20 years The Crisis, the most influential Black political journal of its time, to command the intellectual leadership of the American Black movement, to catalyze and the development of Pan-Africanism, and at the end of his days, to assume a role of leadership in the post-World War II peace movement. These, however, were merely the outlines of complex life that extended over more than 90 years. He was not, though, an entirely benign figure, nor was his work consistently accorded the respect it was due. One might conclude that it was the magnitude of Du Bois's activities that obscured his significance as a historian. But as we shall see, it was not his range that was at issue with his detractors. The opposition to Du Bois was grounded in deeper reservation, the recognition that his work had origins dependent of the impulses of Western liberal and radical thought. Thus, when his contribution to the American historical traditions should have been celebrated by its historians and scholars, the reaction of the Academy was often vilification and neglect. And when he should have been recognized as one of the deans of radical historiography, in his seventh decade, he became one of the two most sophisticated Marxist theorists in America. The orthodox of authorized, quote unquote, intellectual accused him of Marxian heresy, radical chauvinism, and flawed conceptualization. Where there were, however, much more historic reasons for the intolerance found towards Du Bois' works. These reasons can only be identified and understood by a review and analysis of the historical, intellectual, and ideological context from which they arose. It is by now generally understood that the formation of nation states and political reigns precipitate the development of founding myths of origins, in the language of anthropologists. Though the process may have been obscured by time in more distant eras, the emergencies of the bourgeoisie in the 18th and 19th centuries made it explicit. Their use of print and press, their appeals to the seduction of the classes they wished to dominate, made the fabrication of national myth quite evident. These myths were to be recognized in the official instruments of class hegemony, national creed, social ideologies, philosophical tenets, constitutions, and the like. Their function was legitimate the social orders that had come into being. These myths made the new order a necessary one, an inevitable and benevolent event. They indicated to the national populace that the strains of historical novelty, the insecurities and anxieties accompanying the break with established forms were temporary, that change was natural, organic, and right. Founding myths were substituted for history, providing the appearance of historical narratives to what was in actual part fact, in part class serving rationales. Endlessly elaborated, these myths were produced by ideologues who identify with the dominant creed and depended upon those classes in the society that possessed power and the capacity to extend social privilege. The formation of the American state provided no exception. The American Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, the consideration raised in the federal papers were all expressions of the interests and creed of the American bourgeoisie. Soon they were to be argumented by the myths of frontier and patronal plantation, the competitive capitalism of the Yankee, the courage of the plainsman, the later supplemented by tragedy of the war between states and rugged individual, the excitement of the American Industrial Revolution, the generosity of melting pot. Such were the romantic fictions that came to constitute the social ideology of the nation's bourgeoisie. There was, though, an even older mythology, one that preceded the development of an American bourgeoisie, which is nationalist sentiments and War of Independence. Colonialism in America had required a different rationale. The S words. Oh my gosh. Of course you're going to do this to me. There you go. Conventionally, as we have seen in the previous chapters, English colonialism had available to it the S words of the Irish to draw upon. The notion had traveled well. When the need was for labor, the Irish, the poor of the metropole cities. Metropoles are town centers, like capitalist cities or just cities. Metropole cities, the African and the Native American were comfortably herded together under the notion of S words. When the issue had been the expropriation of the lands of the natives, there was little cause to respect the claims of S words. I'm going to say it one. They're using the word savage. Okay? Nothing more. Just so everyone knows what I mean by S word. Or to comprehend their resistance as anything more than S word. Indeed, colonial thought expected quite the opposite. The colonialists were the advanced civilization. Such societies proved their historical significance by the destruction or domination of S words and backwards peoples. Eventually, of course, the ideologies of the pre-bourgeoisie and the bourgeoisie had fused, as a system of manufacturing, plantation, slavery, and farming had closed together into an integrated national economy, sharing the exploitation of land, labor, and natural resources. The social ideology and historical consciousness of the ruling classes acquired two domestic enemies, the indigenous people and black people. In the earlier 19th century, the destruction of native S words and the domination of the imported one became dual proof of the superiority of the new nation. And once the Native American peoples became incapable of resistance, they were further transformed into trivialized, becoming the romantic residue of the Antarctic past, living museum pieces. For black people, however, it was a different story. Throughout much of the 19th century, the African remained a substantial labor force for the further development of the country. Of course, I didn't get approved. Of course not. As a consequence, the political, social, and cultural significance of the African was more enduring. This meant, as Craven suggests, in the following example from the 17th century Virginia, that the efforts taken to resolve the opposition of black in America American thought were so often deliberate and constant that they remained obvious and concise. And conscious. The crude humor with which shipmasters or purchasers drew up ancient history of mythology for the names of Caesar, Hannibal, Nero, Jupiter, Plato, or is it Pluto, at Minervia, the Primus and Secundus who headed one list, and used more than once of ape or monkey for a name records principally an all too prevalent attitude of the white towards the black. During the era that followed, when manufacturing became the most advanced from the form of production and domestic institutions, the most significant political creed, the African was represented as chattel in their economic images, as slaves in their political and social image, as brutish and therefore inaccessible to further development, and finally, as black people. That is, without history. And later, during the industrialization of the country's economy, when individuality and manipulative acumen were at a premium, the black people was a pathetic sharecropper, unskilled and unambitious, the quote happy, not using that word, they use a D word, for whom the society possessed a paternalistic obligation. Finally, in our own time, with the development of corporate structures and the myth of an intensely rationalized and rational society, black people became the irrational, violent, criminal caged person. The cage was civilization and Western culture, obviously available to black people, but inexplicably beyond their grasp. Black historiography developed in opposition to this clone thought and sensibility in American consciousness. This was not the intention, nor in its beginnings. Did it seem likely, since the first effort at writing the history of the race had occurred some decades after the end of the ennobling literature that had accompanied the abolition movement? With the emancipation sign, there was no longer a demand for historical excursion into the black African past to substantiate their humanity and its irresistible degradation by slavery. The noble S-words had ceased to have a function, but Reconstruction had rekindled the ideological attack on black people. 60 years after the assault had been renewed, Du Bois would unhesitantly designate its source. The real frontal attack on Reconstruction, as interpreted by the leaders of national thought in 1870 and for some time thereafter, came from the universities and particularly from Columbia and Johns Hopkins. The movement began with Columbian University and with the advent of John W. Burgess of Tennessee and William A. Dunning of New Jersey as professors of political science and history. Their collective judgment of black people, their quote silent in contempt, as Du Bois characterizes it, became American history. And since men such as these were also intimately involved in the construction of the nation's agenda for the academic study of its political processes, the structures were shared assessments of black people was also a prescription. In order to paint the South as the martyr to inescapable fate, to make the North a magnanimous emancipator, and to ridicule black people as the impossible joke in the whole development, we have in 50 years by label, innuendo, and silence so completely misstated and obliterated the history of black people in America and his relations to its work and government at today, it is almost unknown. It is not only part foundation of our present lawlessness and loss of democratic ideals. It has, more than that, led the world to embrace and worship the color bar as social salvation, and it is helping to range mankind to ranks of mutual hatred and contempt, and the summons of a cheap and false myth. The stakes had been high during the decades of the postbellum, as Thomas Rainborough had seen it in England's convulsive 17th century. The question posed in the years following the American Civil War was either poverty must be democracy to destroy the power of property, or property in fear of poverty will destroy democracy. These ideologues for both victorious northern industrial capital and now chastened southern agrarian capital, the white intelligentsia, academic and otherwise rewove social and historical legends that accommodated the exploitive projects of those ruling classes. The political consciousness of black labor, white labor, and immigrant labor were to be smothered by social discipline, implicit in the legends, complemented by the terror of state discipline, or of state militias, company police, and security agents, the persistent threat of immigration controls, the swelling ranks of reserve labor, racialism as reattired, so that it might once again take its place among the inventory of labor discipline. Driven by the necessity to respond quickly to the rush of working class mobilization followed the war, capital and its ideologue had not daled. In the year 1877, the singles were given for the rest of the century. Black people would be put back. The strikes of white workers would not be tolerated. The industrial and political elites of North and South would take hold of the country and organize the greatest march of economic growth in human history. They would do it with the aid of and at the expense of black labor, white labor, Chinese labor, European immigrant labor, female labor, rewarding them differently by race, sex, national origins, and social class, in such a way as to create separate levels of oppression, a skillful terracing to stabilize the pyramid of wealth. This new repression of black labor was the immediate cause of the circumstances of the profusion of protest materials produced by the black intelligentsia in the last decades of the 19th century. And black history was their desperate invention. Stunned by the saddenness of the reversal of both their own fortunes and those of the black masses, the most representative spokesman of the black petite bourgeoisie responded with the journalistic and literary eloquence that they believe had so well served them and the slaves in previous eras, while the black masses organized, sometimes secretly, but increasingly openly, to protect their political rights. And then when they were lost, in order to immigrate to the American hinterlands or to Liberia, the black intelligentsia remained wedded to the tactics of supplication. These representatives, men of color, as painters, was characterizing them. Instead insisted on the identity that presumed to share with their white class counterparts. As the editor of a black newspaper in San Francisco had declared in 1862, as far as he could see, black Americans were, quote, moved by the same impulse, guided by the same motives, and had the same Yankee-like hedonitiveness of the white Americans. Like many others of his station, He begged his audience indulgence for being black and thus obscured his truer colors. Still, it was the most disheartening period of many of them. They worked hard in their newspapers, pamphlets, their public lectures, and congressional appearance at establishing their Americanism, only to be rebuffed out of hand by the nation's dominant ideologies. Inevitably, it had occurred to some members of the black petite bourgeoisie that their disadvantage in the ideological fray lay in part with their failure to engage the American legend and in midst of the country, whose ideationists were desperately attempting to forge a historical ground national identity. Their lot was reduced to an identification with the horror with which slavery had been concluded in America that was now being reconstituted by its ideologies on the mantle of a manifest destiny presumably inherited from its European origins. The black intelligentsias had a historical bias that was too shallow to support their demand to include the national destinies. Legend as history denies to them the right and as well their capabilities. Let's see what this person's saying. Anyways, don't know. This aspiration of the black middle class required a history that would at once absolve their guilt by association with the catastrophic ending of slavery, lend historical weight to the dignity they claimed as a class, and suggest their potential as participants in the country's future. They required a black historiography that would challenge their exclusion from the nation's racial parochialism, while settling for those very values. When these historiographies did begin, it was not too much a bold initiative against the certainties of nationalist and racialist histories as a plea for sympathy. Oh my gosh, did you live in, whatever. Black history thus began in the shadow of the national myth and as their dialectical negation. Consequently, it contained its own contradiction, i.e., the trivialization of social action, while enveloping those that occurred within the dominant American history. Generations later, it would give rise to a more crucial and truer opposition. But for the time being, it was to match American history in the coin of the realm, monument for monuments, monument for monument, civilization for civilization, great man for great man. George Washington Williams, the first of the major George Washington Williams, the first of the major Afro-American historians, left no doubt about these concerns. In 1882, Williams had published his mammoth classic, The History of the Black Race in America from 1619 to 1880. It consisted of 2 volumes totaling almost 1,100 pages. One may have already surmised that despite this tutelar boundaries, Williams had not confined himself to the events that began in the 17th century. Indeed, like many of his contemporary spokesmen, he had found it appropriate to begin his search into the past by reviewing the role of Africans in the pre-Christian era, when Western civilization, owing its immediate stimulus to Egyptian culture, had been centered around the Mediterranean. The contrast between these eras, the apogee of Williams' mind of African development, and the centuries of black enslavement that followed 2 millennia later, providing him with the opportunity to enunciate his belief. I don't know what I'm talking about. Yeah, sure. His, they use the N-word, position. It is true. In all history up to the present day has been incidental, and collateral. His brightest days were when history was an infant, and since he earlier turned from God, he has found the cold face of hate and a hurtful hand of the Caucasians against him. The black type is the result of degradation. It is nothing more than the lowest strata of the African race. His blood affected with the poison of his low habitation. His blood shriveled. No, I don't know. Shriveled by disease. His intellect veiled in pagan superstition. The noblest yearning of his soul strangled by birth, by the S-word passions of the natural abandoned to sensuality. A poor black person of Africa deserves more our pity than our contempt. The confusion in William's thought was real. He wrote from both I don't know this word. I'm gonna have to figure out this word, everybody. Right back. I haven't complained about anything, my guy. Puritanical perspective with its ethos of God's election, but was as well mindful of the racialist nature of his people's degradation and oppression. Hey, Dooley. But in the later, he was again perversely diverted, since his resolve to write a, quote, true history of the black man, end quote, stemmed from his wish to incite the latter to greater efforts in the struggle of citizenship and manhood, while attacking the most extreme ideological forms that hatred of black people had assumed, quote, sons of Ham, or the curse of Canaan. And while denouncing the institutions of slavery, he still demonstrated a certain ambivalence, tactic but unspoken, of course, could realize the task of black resurrection. For the last decades of the 19th century, the ideological construction of the black petite bourgeoisie had achieved its maturity. The tendency of the black intelligentsia towards the elitist consciousness of race as synthesis of Eurocentric racism and the preoccupation with imperial political forms had achieved its broadest and most articulate expression. The social and concomitant psychological and an intellectual process of the formation of the black middle class began in the 18th century and had by then obtained an extensive objective configuration. No longer slowed down by the political and economic structures of slavery and its hegemonic envelopments, freed from the moral compulsions of social identification with the black peasantry and peons by the slaves, counterfeit freedom, the ambition of the black petty bourgeoisie found realization in institutions consciously designed by themselves and sponsors for classes, maintenances, and augmentation. With their position as a broker stratum, seemingly secured from the above by the ruling class, that proffered them in increments of privilege while ruthlessly repressing mass black mobilization. The ideological restraint that had been so much a part of the character of the class's early generations became less evident. the black petite bourgeoisie could not indulge in a delusion of being capable of challenging the capitalist world system on what they took to be its own terms, race power. The political ideology that emerged from the black universities and colleges, the pulpits above their denominationally stratified congressions were professional associations, were creative literature, and their historiography was presently mystically chauvinist, authoritarian, and pastoralistic. From the post-Reconstruction on into the next century, the logic of the formation of the black petite bourgeoisie and its intelligentsia was building to these conclusions. As Jeremiah Moses argues, it was becoming apparent to the post-bellum generation of black leaders that individual accomplishments offers little protection from the threats and abuse of the caste-like American system. The middle-class black people would remain victims of prejudice so long as the masses remain untortured, impoverished, and demoralized. The goal of uplifting the freemen was similar to the goal of uplifting Africa. It was to be carried on for the same process as the old antebellum African civilizationism. The building of an Afro-American culture would demonstrate to all the world that black people were able and willing to make contributions to the American life and were therefore fit to be United States citizens. As the masses were elevated, the bourgeoisie would rise correspondingly. These were the purposes that inspired Bishop David A. Payne of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, AME, to form a Bethel Literary and Historical Association in 1881, which in 1897 was incorporated into American Black Academy by its founder, the Black Presbyterian Cambridge-trained missionary Alexander Crummell, which complemented the studied feminism and the National Association of Women of Color, formerly the National Freedom of Afro-American Women, catalyzed into being by Joseph St. Pierre Ruffin, Mary Church Terrell, Ida B. Wells, Margaret Murray, Washington, and others in 1895, and provided a specific material character to some black colleges. Inevitably, spokesmen were driven to cosmetic excess. William Ferris declared that he preferred Black Saxon or black. They used the N-words, by the way. While Boston biracial people, elite, appropriated Afro-American to itself, and earlier, William C. Snails had employed Black Saxons. But Cromwell saw no need for equivocations. For him, the identity, function, and nature of their class were obvious. Who are the agents to raise and elevate these people to a higher plane of being? The answer will at once flash upon the intelligence. It is to be affected by the scholars of a philanthropist, I can't say that word, philanthropist, which come forth in these days from the schools. They are to be the scholars, for to transform, stimulate, and uplift a people is a work of intelligence. It is a work which demands the clear induction of historic facts and their applications to new circumstances. A work which will require the most skillful resources and wise, particularly practicality of superior men. According to W.J. Moses, hold on a second and see who's saying so. I'm doing a reading, not taking guests yet. Okay. According to W.J. Moses, it was Cromwell who initiated the synthesis of his class interests into the coherent ideology. But it was others I could suggest, like George W. Williams and Carter J. Woodson, who codified it into historiographic expressions negating the national legend. Still, what they achieved was but a fragile construction, its integrity subject so to challenge whatever capitalist indulgence, the foundation upon which it rested, might dissipate or be withdrawn. Mercifully, perhaps it was also true that the possibility of this occurring was beyond the comprehension of most of them. Neither social Darwinism nor their comfortable gospels suggest anything but the most temporary diversions as possible. When the crisis did come and black people mobilized to the struggle against it, the black petite bourgeoisie was again largely unprepared to abandon their illusory partnership with power. Du Bois, like his predecessors and contemporaries, William Brown, Carter Woodson, Bishop Henry Turner, George Williams, and the Caribbean-born Edward Wilmot Blyden, had been deeply implicated in the race uplift historiographic traditions. And I have to do another one. Let's do that one, see if that works. Okay. Du Bois was among the 40 black intellectuals enlisted in the American Black Academy, in which Cromwell was the first president. In the Academy's occasional papers, Du Bois published his Cromwellian essay, The Conversation of Race, showing that he was hardly out of step with the conservative Cromwell during his years with the American Black Academy. They used the N-word. And classical black nationalist traits of mysticism, authoritarianism, collectivizationism, and collectivism were strong elements in authoritarianism, or in the conversation of race. Du Bois called upon the Academy to exercise a firm leadership and to become, quote, the epitome of an expression of the intellect of the black-blooded people of America, end quote. The black leaders were not to organize for such mundane purposes as the stealing of political spoils, nor, quote, merely to protest past resolutions, end quote. Black leadership should be united in its effort to improve the black masses, to fight against loafing, gambling, crime, and prostitution, to strive for, quote, the rearing of a race ideal in America and Africa to the glory of God and the uplifting of black people, end quote. In the earliest phases of his career under the direct influence of Cromwell, the Academy, and the omnipresence organizational politics of Booker T. Washington, Du Bois had found the notion of an elite, a talented 10th appeal. The black race, like all races, is going to be saved by its exceptional men. Problem of education, then, among black people, must first be all deal with the talented 10th. It is the problem of development, the best of this race, that they may guide the masses away from the contamination of the death of the worst. It's their own and other races. Of course I wasn't approved. Today I'm not being approved. At the time, he saw the differences between his design and that of Washington as quite significant. In time, he knew better. In his last autobiography, written in the, quote, last decades of his 95th year, he made it clear that in the intervening years, he had come to recognize that the differences between them were insignificant when compared to what they did not comprehend. Their dispute was not over ideology, but power. I believe in the higher education of the talented 10th, who through their knowledge of modern culture could guide the American black person into a higher civilization. I knew that without this, black people would have to accept white leadership, and that such leadership could not always be trusted. Moore Washington or the others had believed that black people as an efficient worker could gain wealth, and that eventually through his ownership of capital, he would be able to achieve and recognize place in American culture. He proposed to put the emphasis at present upon training in the skilled trades and encouragement of industry and common labor. These two theories of black progress were not absolutely contradictory. Neither I nor Booker Washington understood the nature of capitalistic exploitation of labor and the necessity of the direct attack on the principle of exploitation as the beginning of labor uplift. What Du Bois enveloped Washington and circulated through his fingers. Not only did presidents of the United States consult Booker T. Washington, but governors and congressmen, philanthropists conferred with him. Scholars wrote to him. Tuskegee became a vast information bureau and center of advice. After a time, almost no black institutions could collect funds without the recommendation or acquiescence of Mr. Washington. Few political appointments of black people were made anywhere in the United States without his consent. Even the careers of rising young men of color were very often determined by his advice, and certainly his opposition was fatal. Moreover, it must be not forgotten that his Tuskegee machine was not solely the idea and activity of black folks at Tuskegee. It was largely encouraged and given financial aid through certain white groups and individuals in the North. This northern group had clear objectives. They were capitalists and employers of labor. These black people were not to be encouraged as voters in the new democracy, nor were they to be left at the mercy of the reactionary South. They were good laborers, and they could be made of tremendous profit to the North. They could become a large labor force, and properly guided, they could restrain the unbridled demands of white labor, born of the Northern labor unions, and now spreading to the South and encouraged by European socialism. It is not entirely the case, as Lawrence Redrick suggests in 1937, that the uplift tradition from which Du Bois would eventually emerge possessed a deeply ingrained naivety. It would appear that the major part of its obtuseness results from the mask of deception behind which the struggle over power within the black petite bourgeoisie was taking place. It was not merely an etiquette of intra-class division that made deception necessary. The material stakes were high. In 1903, for example, Andrew Carnegie, I can't say it, had extended a gift of $600,000 to Tuskegee. Most significantly, however, the black petite bourgeoisie was bound by a class strategy that narrowed the political range. The protests of the masses of black people could not be allowed to move beyond a diffuse state, but at the same time must give the appearance of racial solidarity. The premium for which Du Bois challenged Washington was power, not leadership. It was, however, the nature and settings of the struggle that propelled Du Bois beyond the acceptance parameters and intra-class conflict. The radicalization of Du Bois took place during a historical period characterized by the re-intensification of the suppression of black people in the United States and subsequent massive black response. In the South and in the Midwest, the populist movement of the 1880s and 1890s, spurred by the conversion crisis of world capitalism and with its third-party aspirations, built around the alliance between white and black farmers, peasants, and organized labor, and once again mobilized the black masses. Legal and illegal violence, election corruption, and the renewed emphasis on white supremacy were the combining response of the ruling classes, industrial and planters, which orchestrated state and federal powers and the instruments of propaganda. Electoral restrictions stripped poor black people and whites from the vote were enacted in several states. Lynching accelerated, with the number of black victims surpassing that of whites in 1889. And the populist movement was transformed into the shambles by the unleashing of radical racial maneuvers. The most dramatic response of the black masses was migration. And when the cycle of drought, then heavy rains, and the bull weevil vermin decimated cotton production in the years of 1915 to 1916, was combined with war industry and the accession of European immigration. The migration of the black masses became the Great Migration. Early migration were dwarfed by the surge of black people northward after 1900, and especially after 1910, according to various contemporaneous estimates. Between 1890 and 1910, around 200,000 black Southerners fled to the north, and behind 1910 to 1920, another 300,000 to 1 million followed. The Department of Labor reported that in the 18th months of 1916 and 17, migration was variously estimated at 200,000 to 700,000. A black presence in the northern industrial sectors of the country became a new fact of American experience. The most important consequence of these mass mobilization, that is both the short-lived alliance with the agrarian rebellion of populism and the urban migration, was that they amounted to the visible renunciation of the black petite bourgeoisie leadership by the black peasantry. Hundreds of thousands of black people demonstrated that they were no longer willing to tolerate the social and economic insecurities of living in the rural South, to work in semi-slavery as the nation's cheapest labor, and to perish under the dual oppression of the racist patrons of the white Southern ruling class and the class opportunism of the ambitious and presumptuous black petite bourgeoisie. It is not surprising then that in these circumstances, some members of the black middle class should discover in this an occasion for renouncing those among them who dominate their class politics and historical visions. In the same act, these renegades were drawn into the orbit of the masses of black people and the radical tradition. William Moreau Trotter, Du Bois' Harvard classmate, preceding him in this realization, and within the nexus of the Nigerian movement, begun in 1905, certainly disciplined Du Bois in a new militancy. Trotter, more than any other single individual, was responsible for transforming Du Bois from a cautious critic to a militant activist. It was Du Bois, however, who, by temperament, trained and experience, would be capable of bringing his revolt to fruition. As his work certifies, it was to build in his intellect slowly. And I gotta look up this word, everybody, real quick. Inelectable. It's inelectable. Slowly inelectable. The evidence of his development was to be apparent from his invocation of the militancy of John Brown's, published in 1909, through his short essay with the socialist movement, his analysis of the imperialist basis of the Great War, his reaction to Bolshevik Russia, the frustration and compromise suffered as a race operating in the national and international arenas of the bourgeois democratic politics, responsive to only one racial consciousness, white superiority. By the time the most profound crisis in the history of world capitalism occurred, Du Bois was cautiously divorced from the legend of the legend of, as well as its permutations. End of that. Anybody have any questions? No one's up here. Du Bois and the Reconstruction of History in American Politics Thought. In 1935, Du Bois published his third historical work on the economic forces and ideological dynamics that gave 19th century America its character. Unlike the previous two studies, the suppression of African slave trade and John Brown, which were more conventional in narrative and analysis, Black Reconstruction in America possessed a theory of history, a theory based on a foundation of economic analysis and class struggle. It was not simply a historical work, but history subject to theory. The emphasis was on the relations of things. Du Bois, however, had not neglected the play of history, its scenario. He had intended to, and did, trace the critical phenomenology of the American Civil War and its aftermath, the Reconstruction. From his research were emerged a fundamentally revised construction of those periods that stood as a critique of American historiography, with its racial biases, domineering regionalism, and distorting philosophical commitments. Methodologically, moreover, Black Reconstruction possessed a rigor consciously designed to match and supersede Ulrich B. Phillips' earlier, quote, classic work on slavery, American Black Slavery. They used the N-word. Du Bois, in his attempt to authoritatively identify what he took to be the truer character of the Reconstruction era, seems to have realized the necessity of returning to the experience of and training of historical research. In writing he had gathered at Howard University and the University of Berlin in the late 19th century, but he eschewed in John Brown. His radical and radically different interpretations of the war and its aftermath were confirmed formally to the methodological canons of historiography. So with that, he might subvert the substance and that tradition. Black Reconstruction, however, was more the result of another purpose, a concern that was quite different from the task of historical revision. Du Bois committed himself to the development of the theory of history, which by its emphasis on mass action was both a critique of the ideologies of American socialist movements and a revision of Marx's theory of revolution and class struggle. From the integument of the American Civil War and the Reconstruction, Du Bois attempted to identify a unique character of mass praxis, class consciousness, ideology, and contradictions as they had occurred in the dialectics of American social and historical development. In so doing, he was going beyond the argument of America, exceptionalism, quote unquote, and had persisted in the ideology of American Marxist left. He was seeking to identify historically and analytically the processes that during the Depression years had given American social dynamics their character and potentialities. Ultimately, Black Reconstruction was a political work in the confrontation with the nationalist and reactionary American intelligentsia at the level of historiography, and the confrontation with the political left in terms of the theory of capitalism and the ideology of emergent socialism. Du Bois presumed to alert and instruct revolutionary Black leadership. With regards to these several concerns, he had made his position quite clear in 1933, a period coincident with the writing of Black Reconstruction. In a remarkable lecture delivered before the participants of Rosenwald found sponsors conference at Howard University, addressed himself to the role played by the American intellectual elite. Du Bois had argued, if we give Mr. Roosevelt the right to meddle with the dollar, if we give Herr Schmittler the right to expel Jewish people, if we give to Mussolini the right to think for Italians, we do this because we know nothing ourselves. We are, as a nation, ignorant of the functions and meaning of money, and we are looking around helplessly to see if anybody else knows. This is not, as some assume, the failure of democracy. It is the failure of education, of justice, and of truth. We have lied so long about money and business. We do not know now where truth is. Unequivocally, Du Bois was associating the failure of American nation to achieve an effective policy in the midst of the Depression with the, quote, the fact that it was not intelligent democracy, end quote. This, he believed, was a consequence of the ideological deception, the misconception that characterized liberal American thought. Turning to the American left, Du Bois was no less critical of the American Communist Party, CPUSA. Du Bois declared, the task that I have recently been sitting myself is to blunt the wedge the Communist Party is driving into our group, and to do this not because of any impunity of fear or essential disagreement with the communists. If I were in Russia, I should be enthusiastic communist. I should be an enthusiastic communist. If the Communist Party in the United States had the leadership and knowledge which our situation calls for, I certainly would join it. But it is today arrogant, ignorant of fact and history and the American scene, and is trying to overemphasize the truth that the natural leaders of people of color, the educated and trained classes, have had goals and interests different from the masses of Black people. There is partial truth in this, and partial falsehood. American race prejudice has so pounded the mass of Black people together that they have not separated into such economic classes. But on the other hand, they undoubtedly have had an ideology, and if they had been free, we would have had within our race the same exploiting setup that we see around about us. Immersed in research into post-Civil War labor history, Du Bois was conscious of the problems that had beset mass movements, bringing together whites and black people, problems that he felt spokesmen and communists ignored. Though now clearly benevolent towards the Black petite bourgeoisie, he was still relying on the notions of racial solidarity imposed from without to defend his class from attack from the left. But by now, Du Bois had begun to temper his own talented 10th, quote unquote, program of social mobilization. At the conference, he seemed mightily distressed with the vanguardism quote unquote, with which he had been earlier identified. And in point of fact, he had appeared to reverse his position. The black elite, of which he had been so optimistic in its neutral function of leadership of the black masses, was now understood to be ideological reactionary. A lesson he was learning within the National Association for the Advancement of People of Color. This question of ideology and its impact on human motives and social relations would become a dominant theme of Black Reconstruction. But here, its immediate significance was its toll on Du Bois' thinking. It had forced him to reassess the black masses and their revolutionary significance. He had at least begun to form a commitment response to the indictment of the black middle class and its intelligentsia, which a recent event of the late 1920s and early 1930s represented. The emergence of the mass movement, the Universal Black Improvement Association, the formation of the militant nationalists into the African Blood Brotherhood, the Scottsboro debacle, which pitted the conservative NAACP against the Communist Party's International Labor Defense. And according with his criticism of the American Communist Party, Du Bois was addressing himself directly to the problem of the alienation of the black elite from the black masses. He did this in part by reminding the elite subtly of its dependence upon the masses. Yet he still had not himself reached the level of historical comprehension that he would demonstrate in Black Reconstruction. There he would come to a realization of the historical forces emergent from the people, specifically the capacities of the black masses to take steps decisive in their own liberation. Finally, in the Roosevelt Conference lecture, we find that Du Bois' analysis of the depression which international capitalism was experiencing in the 1930s parallels his analysis of the crisis brought on by slavery in the earlier stages of American capitalist development. Both economically and politically, the depression and the crisis of slavery would fundamentally transform into the mode of capitalist relations. Furthermore, both had participated revolutionary movements and revolutionary social change. The matter of what's going on? Oh, sushi's good. The matter of the greatest import is that instead of our facing today a stable world moving at a uniform rate of progress towards a well-defined goals, we are facing revolution. I trust you will not be as scared by this word as you were Thursday. Du Bois was referring to the audience reaction to the speech by Dr. Brodus Mitchell of Johns Hopkins University. I am not discussing a coming revolution. I am trying to impress the fact upon you that you are already in the midst of a revolution. You are already in the midst of war. That there has been no war of modern times that has taken so great a sacrifice of human life and human spirits as a extraordinary period through which we are passing today. Some people envision revolution chiefly as a matter of blood and guns and the more visible method of force. But that, after all, is merely the temporary and outward manifestation. Real revolution is within, that comes before and after the explosion, as a matter of long suffering and deprivation, the death of courage and the bitter triumph of despair. This is the inevitable prelude to deceive the enormous change, a decisive and enormous change. And that is the thing that is on us now. We are not called upon then to discuss whether we want revolution or not. We have not got it. Our problem is how we are coming out of it. On review, then, Du Bois had remarked on a weakness of American culture and its political institutions in the face of a deep crises in its economic structure. He was concerned about the inability of the American left, as represented by the CPUSA. Recall, he had already tried the American Socialist Party and found it wanting 21 years before his lecture was given to clearly identify the material force of racism as it relates to the left's struggle to destroy capitalism and replace it with socialism. He had exposed the ahistorical and materialistic ideology that dominated the black elite and black leadership. And finally, he had indicated the failure of American revolutionists to recognize that one of the objective conditions for revolution, on which goes beyond the onslaught of economic crisis and immensuration, is a consciousness of the social processes of revolution. Du Bois, however, was concerned for why these things had become true for American society in the 1930s. He was interested in determining how it was possible that American culture and its institutions had become so estranged from the democratic deal with which they had so long been structurally and ideologically identified. Moreover, how was it possible that American socialists could be so ill-equipped to deal with the black worker, the black community, and the social relations of black people? How had the black elite become wedded ideologically to capitalism and grown alienated and contemptuous of the black masses? Why was the 20th century America revolution theory so ill-conceived, the revolutionary movement unrecognizable, the revolutionary change of transformation to matter of contingency rather than praxis? He believed the answer to these questions reside in the history of the Republic. More specifically, he pursued them in the contradictions of that history. Slavery and capitalism was next. So Du Bois was calling out that the racialism was still inside each of those movements, and that somehow the United States created the black bourgeoisie, so that in turn turns into the black the black comprador class, who maintains the capitalist relations and the status quo for the capitalist system and racism. Slavery and capitalism. In the beginning of Black Reconstruction, Du Bois identified the fundamental contradictions of American history, the contradictions that would subvert America's founding ideology, distort institutions, traumatize its social relations and class formation, and in the 20th century, confuse its rebels and revisionists. For the day of its birth, the anomaly of slavery plagued a nation which asserted the equality of all men and sought to derive powers of government from the constant and of the governed, within sound of the voices of those who said this lived more than half a million black slaves, forming nearly 1/5 of the population of the new nation. It was thus the black worker, as founding stones of the new economic system of the 19th century, and for the modern world, who brought civil war in America, he was its underlying cause. Its spite of effort to base the strife upon union and national power. Yet now let us pay close attention to what Du Bois was saying. Slavery was a specific historical institution through which the black worker had been introduced into the modern world system. However, it was not as slaves that one could come to an understanding of the significance of these black men, women, and children had for American development. It was as labor. He had entitled the first chapter of Black Reconstruction, The Black Worker. The terms of his analysis were quite important in Du Bois. They were a part of his beginning and the transformation of the historiography of American civilization. The naming of things, in the changing of names of things, he sought to provide the basis for a new conceptualization of their relationship. In the first 3 chapters of his work, Du Bois established the rules of his analysis. The institutions of American slave labor could not be effectively conceptualized as a thing in and of itself. Rather, it was a particular historical development of world capitalism that expropriated the labor of African workers as, quote, primitive accumulation. American slavery was a subsystem of world capitalism. Black labor became the foundation stone on only the Southern social structure, but of North manufacture, the commerce of the English factory system, the European commerce of buying and selling on the worldwide scale. New cities were built on the results of black labor, and a new labor problem involving all white labor arose both in Europe and America. And American slavery would also consist of a social relation giving their character by the ideology of white racial superiority. There was, in 1863, a real meaning to slavery, different from what we may apply to labor today. It was in part psychological and enforced personal feeling and inferiority, the calling of another master, the standing with hat in hand. It was the helplessness. It was the defenselessness of family life. It was the submergence below the arbitrary will of any sort of individuals. The South, subservient religious leaders reverted to the curse of Canaan. It presupposed scientists gathered and supplemented all available doctrines of racial inferiority. It scattered schools and pedantic periodicals, repeating these legends. A basis in reason, philanthropy, and science was built up for black slavery. All of this was necessary for the persistence of slavery through the 17th and 18th centuries, and for its meteoric development. At the early 19th century, the tissue of a nation would develop code by its slave past. Labor, capitalism, and slavery. Let's see how far it is. Well, we'll just go ahead. We're still on Du Bois. This is all Du Bois. So this is his next analysis of labor capital. So what he did is he analyzed the racial condition between these demographics of people. Du Bois was arguing that once slavery was addressed in comprehensive terms, in the world historical terms, its true nature was revealed. Beneath its appearance was a feudal agrarianism, lay the real relations of slavery to the emergence of modern capitalism. As America was a critical subsector of this developing system, the conflicts between American creed and reality, the contradictions of American society, the distortions of its social structures, the political institutions ensued from this dependency on slavery and would resound throughout the system into the 19th century. Slavery then was not a historical aberration. It was not a, quote, mistake in a otherwise bourgeois democratic age. It was, and its imprint continues to be systemic. Here is a real modern labor problem. Here is a kernel of the problem of religion and democracy and humanity. Words of futile gestures availed nothing. Out of the exploitation of the black proletariat. They use comes the surplus value flinched from human beasts, which in cultured lands, the machine and the harnessed power, veiled and concealed. The emancipation of man is the emancipation of labor, and the emancipation of labor is the freeing of that basic majority of workers who are Asian, brown, and black. In America, free labor, the vast majority of it supplied by immigrants, Europeans from Ireland, England, Italy, and Germany, was also profoundly affected. A new labor that came to the United States, while it was poor, used to oppression and the accustomed to the low standards of living, was not willing, after each reached America, to regard itself as a permanent labor class. And it is in the light of these facts that the labor movement among white Americans must be studied. The successful, well-paid American laboring class formed because of its property and ideals. The petty bourgeoisie, ready always to join capital in exploiting common labor, white and black, foreign and native, eschewing the traditions forming in the European labor movement that would mature into the 19th century's socialism, and in the First and Second International, syndicalism and anarchism. The transplanted European worker became preoccupied with the responsibility of accumulating wealth and power, of becoming capitalist. Thus, it was the American liberalism in the 19th century, with its ideals and individualism and its antagonism to socialism, became manifest in a particular way. This character was molded by an economic order that severely delimited material well-being and a racial consciousness that at one end, at the same time, removed an entire section of the working class, black people, from the possibilities of access to the well-being while also supplying a fictive measure of status to non-black workers. The wisest of the leaders could not clearly envision just how slave labor, in conjunction with competition with free labor, tended to reduce all labor toward slavery. It was only a minority of these non-black workers that would join the liberal intellectuals and freedmen to form an abolitionist movement. Du Bois had stated as early as 1915 that the labor aristocracy that was the result of the trade unionism of the materialistic labor movement in Germany, England, and France, as well as in the United States, as a crucial support to the imperialism and colonialism of the late 19th century. In the United States, black and non-black labor became politically opposed. Instead of becoming one great party, the northern non-black working class movement effectively excluded the free men, the slaves, and the 5 million poor whites of the South. It was even more specifically inclusionist after 1850, as it concentrated on a base of skilled industrial workers and craftsmen. But it was a more generalized antagonism that would envelop black and non-black workers during the Civil War itself. This conflict would erupt into race wars against black people, with the enactment of a draft laws in 1863, and with the encouragement of pro-slavery and pro-Southern Copperheads from the North, the frustration of the non-black workers with their living and working conditions, and the war were turned against black people. In the summer of 1863, hundreds of black people were killed by mobs of workers in New York City. The report of the Merchants Committee on the draft riot says of the, quote, black people, quote, driven by fear of death at the hands of the mob, who the week previous had, as you remember, brutally murdered by hanging on the trees and lampposts, several of their number and cruelly beaten and robbed many others, burned and sacking their houses, driving nearly all from the streets, alleys, and docks upon which they had previously obtained an honest, though humble living. These people had been forced to take refuge in Blackwell's Island, at police stations on the outskirts of the city, in the swamp and woods back of Bergen, New Jersey, Weeksville, and in the barns of outhouses of farmers of Long Island and Mauritiana. More than once in Black Reconstruction, in his editorial in the Crises and other works, Du Bois would return to this period in order to identify the root of racial violence, and in the labor movement of the 20th century. It also provided, he believed, an explanation of the traditions of skepticism found among Black people for organized labor. What was true was the mainstream of American labor movement was also a factor in the radical tradition in the country. With mid-19th century socialism had been largely transferred from areas of Europe where antipaths? Let me make sure this word. Hold on, everybody. Antipathies towards black people were inconsequential. Its adherents, too, had not been capable, generally. Hold on a second, everybody. For what? And resistance, be capable of generally of resisting and corrosive influence of slavery. This had been the case for both Marxist and non-Marxist socialists. The precedent established during this period would be of no substantial help to 20th century socialists, where their programs directly and indirectly addressed themselves to the Black problem. Even when the Marxian ideas arrived, there was a split. The earlier representatives of the Marxian philosophy in America agreed with the older Union movement and depreciating with entanglement with the abolition controversy. After all, abolition represented capital, and the whole movement was based on manqueshi sentimentally, and not on the demands of workers, or at least of the white workers. And so the earlier American Marxists simply gave up the idea of introducing the Black worker into the socialist commonwealth at that time. Though there have been exceptions, the lack of identity between interests of Black and non-Black workers was fairly consistent in the labor movement. Wherever one looked among those who saw the movement in political electoral terms, or those who advocated revolutionary violence, or those who were committed to economic trade unionism, the labor movement was most often the best ambivalent towards Black liberation and progress. The ideology of racism, in combination with its self-interest, functioned to pit immigrant and poor white workers against Black workers and the slave. And after the Civil War, the same social consciousness divided the working classes, immigrants and white, from the ex-slave. More than 20 years before the appearance of Black Reconstruction, and while his experience with the Socialist Party was still fresh in his mind, Du Bois had recognized this as a contradiction in the labor movement. And during the intervening years, his anger had not dissipated. When it appeared in Black Reconstruction, it was no longer simply a warning to a negligent labor movement, but an indictment By then, the labor movement and capitalism were older and in deep crisis. By then, Du Bois spoke of black radical. Indeed, the plight of the white working class throughout the world today is directly traceable to black slavery in America, in which modern commerce and industry was founded, in which persisted and to threaten free labor until it was partially overthrown in 1863. Partially, the resulting color caste founded the restraint and retained by capitalism was adopted forward and approved by white labor and resulted in subordination of people of color labor to white profits the world over. Thus, the majority of the world's labor, by insistence of white labor, became the basis of a system of industry which ruined democracy and showed its perfect fruit in World War and Depression. And this book seeks to tell the story. And we'll stop there at slavery and democracy. So all Du Bois' analysis of the labor movements, how white workers and how all these people addressed the black situation. And it was horrible. Page number 303. We're getting there. All right, everybody. Since we have no one coming up, I'm going to go ahead and go. See, I want to see something real quick. Make sure. Okay, yeah. Yeah. We're going to go ahead and go. And we'll stop on slavery and democracy. And we'll learn more about Du Bois's analysis of the black masses in the relations of the white workers and the intelligentsias and the white intellectuals too. And how the black masses basically help develop what we have here now that gives us a comfort and development. So thank you, black people, for creating everything for free. I wish that never happened. But that's what they're going off, that they basically developed the United States free and through discrimination. Even free men were discriminated big time and unalived because of being black, because we're so scared of black people for some reason, you know? So you can also kind of blame the ideology of, it looks like, of the ruling class too, to implement this ideology of racism too, for us to continue. Yeah. But anyways, I hope everybody has a good night. I will talk to you later. As soon as I can.